The words hit me like a slap across the face, right there in the funeral home parking lot. Come on, Michael, we both know Dad kept you around out of pity, my brother Derek said, straightening his expensive tie. The charity case of the family. His wife Lisa smirked beside him, her hand resting on their leased Mercedes. I stood there in my 10-year-old truck, soil still under my fingernails from the morning shift at the county water treatment facility where I worked as a senior operations engineer. 51 years old, and my younger brother still saw me as the failure. I didn't respond. I never did. That was my way. Observe, absorb, move forward. Derek had always been the golden child, the one who went to business school, who married well, who posted pictures of vacation homes he rented for weekend getaways. I was the one who stayed in our hometown, who checked on Dad every week, who fixed his plumbing at midnight and drove him to doctor appointments at dawn. But standing there, watching Derek's taillights disappear toward the reception at some country club I couldn't afford, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not even hurt anymore. Just a quiet, cold certainty that some things were about to change. I climbed into my truck and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing slowly. The funeral had been small. Dad had wanted it that way. What Derek didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Dad and I had talked about a lot more than plumbing and blood pressure medication during those weekly visits. The house felt enormous and empty when I returned that evening. My wife Sarah was at her sister's place, giving me space to grieve in my own way. I appreciated that about her. 26 years of marriage had taught her when I needed silence. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Dad and I had shared countless conversations over the past 5 years, ever since Mom passed. He'd come over every Sunday like clockwork, always bringing something: a bag of oranges from the grocery store, a book he thought I'd like, sometimes just stories about the neighborhood. We'd talk about water systems and engineering problems, about the town's infrastructure and how things had changed since he retired from the post office. But we also talked about family, about disappointment, about the difference between what people showed the world and who they really were. Dad had watched Derek's trajectory with increasing concern. The business ventures that never quite materialized, the loans that never got repaid, the gradual realization that my brother's success was mostly smoke and mirrors held together by credit cards and his wife's family money. Meanwhile, I had quietly built a life. 30 years at the same facility, working my way from technician to engineer. A paid-off house. A daughter finishing her master's degree in environmental science. Savings that grew steadily through careful planning and living below our means. Dad had seen all of it, had witnessed the contrast between Derek's flash and my substance. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and furniture polish. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always did for important appointments. Derek showed up 10 minutes late, Lisa in tow, both of them radiating impatience. "Let's make this quick," Derek said, barely nodding at me as he took his seat. "I've got a conference call at 3. The attorney, a patient man named Mr. Whitmore who'd handled Dad's affairs for decades, opened a folder with practiced care. I'd met with him twice before, once 5 years ago and once last month, though Derek didn't know about either meeting. Mr. Whitmore began reading the will with the kind of steady, professional tone that revealed nothing about the contents. Dad's estate wasn't enormous by any means, but it was substantial enough to matter. The house in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably, a decent pension payout, savings accumulated over 40 years of careful postal service employment. Derek leaned forward when Mr. Whitmore reached the section about the house. I watched my brother's face, seeing the calculations forming behind his eyes. That house, in today's market, could fetch $400,000 easily. Maybe more. Split 2 ways, that was a significant amount of money. Except the will didn't split it 2 ways. Mr. Whitmore's voice remained steady as he read the clause that left the house, the savings, and the majority of Dad's estate to me, with a smaller monetary bequest to Derek. The room went silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Derek's face went through several colors. Confusion first, then red, then an angry purple that reminded me of our childhood when he didn't get his way. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "Dad wouldn't. There's no way he'd." Mr. Whitmore slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "Your father anticipated questions. He left this letter to be read in the event of any disputes." Derek snatched it, tore it open, and began reading. I already knew what it said. Dad had shown me a draft 6 months ago, though he'd made some changes since then. I watched my brother's expression crumble as he read Dad's careful, deliberate words explaining his decision. The letter detailed every unreturned loan, every broken promise, every time Derek had been too busy to visit while I was changing Dad's furnace filter or driving him to physical therapy. It mentioned the Sunday dinners, the emergency calls I'd answered at 2 in the morning, the way I'd sit with Dad during his insomnia nights after Mom died, just talking about nothing and everything until he could finally sleep. But more than that, it talked about character, about the difference between appearing successful and actually being stable, about the kind of man Dad hoped we'd each become and his assessment of which of us had achieved it. "This is manipulation," Lisa hissed, reading over Derek's shoulder. "He manipulated you, Michael. Poisoned an old man's mind against his own son." I spoke for the first time since entering the office. Dad was sharper at 83 than most people at 50. Nobody manipulated him. My voice came out calm, factual, without heat. That seemed to enrage Derek even more than if I'd shouted. "You always did this," he said, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Played the martyr, the devoted son, while I was out actually building something with my life. You think working at a water plant makes you better than me? You think living in the same boring town your whole boring life is some kind of virtue?" I met his eyes steadily. "I think showing up matters. I think keeping promises matters. I think being there when you say you will matters." Derek's jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought he might actually take a swing at me, but Lisa grabbed his arm. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "The will is legally sound and was executed with full mental competency. If you wish to contest it, that's your right. Though I should mention that would trigger an additional provision your father included." He indicated another section of the document. That had been thorough. Any contest would result in Derek's bequest being redirected to charity. My brother stared at the page, then at me, then back at the page. The fight drained out of him visibly. He looked suddenly smaller, older, defeated in a way that should have felt satisfying, but mostly just made me tired. They left without another word, Lisa's heels clicking rapidly down the hallway like machine gun fire. Mr. Whitmore and I sat in the settling silence. "Your father was very proud of you," he said quietly. "He told me so many times. Wanted to make sure you knew that, even if he didn't always say it directly." I nodded, not trusting my voice for a moment. Dad had been a man of actions more than words, a trait I'd apparently inherited. We wrapped up the remaining paperwork, discussed timelines for transferring assets, and settling the estate. The process would take a few months, but it was straightforward. No complications, no surprises beyond the obvious one that Derek had just experienced. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through town, past the post office where Dad had worked for 38 years, past the elementary school Derek and I had both attended, past the park where Dad used to take us on Saturday mornings. The town looked the same as always, modest, unpretentious, real. When I got home, Sarah was waiting with dinner warming in the oven. She searched my face, then pulled me into a hug without asking anything. That's love, I thought, knowing when silence is the kindest offering. We ate quietly, her hand occasionally reaching across the table to touch mine. Later, sitting on our back porch as the sun set, she finally asked how it went. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did. The next few weeks passed in a strange limbo. I continued working my regular shifts, maintaining the complex systems that kept clean water flowing to 30,000 homes. There was something grounding about the work, the concrete problem solving, the tangible results. A pump fails, you diagnose it, you fix it, water flows. I wished human relationships could be troubleshot so cleanly. Derek didn't call. Neither did Lisa. I hadn't expected them to. Our daughter Emma came home for a weekend, taking a break from her graduate research on watershed management. Over coffee, I told her about the inheritance, about the confrontation, about the letter her grandfather had left. She was quiet for a long time. "I remember Grandpa's Sunday visits," she said finally. "How you two would sit at that table for hours. I used to think you were just talking about boring stuff, pipes and water pressure. But he was really seeing you, wasn't he? Really knowing you." I felt something catch in my throat. Yeah, he was." Emma reached over and squeezed my hand. "Uncle Derek never understood that the best inheritance isn't money. It's being known, being seen for who you actually are, not who you're pretending to be." She was wise beyond her years, my daughter. Probably got that from her mother. That evening, after Emma had returned to school, I received an unexpected email. The sender was an attorney representing Derek, formally notifying me that they would not be contesting the will. The message was brief, professional, impersonal, but it was closure of a sort. I decided to keep Dad's house rather than sell it. Sarah and I didn't need the money urgently, and there was something right about preserving it, at least for a while. We spent weekends clearing out decades of accumulated possessions, sorting through boxes of photographs and documents, old tools and books, the physical archaeology of a life well lived. In the attic, I found a box I'd never seen before, tucked away behind the insulation. Inside were letters, dozens of them, organized by date, spanning years. Letters from me to Dad during the 2 years I'd spent at a technical college in another state, before Sarah and I got married and I returned home. I'd forgotten I'd written so many. They were full of mundane details, questions about engineering problems, updates about my life. Dad had kept every single one. Beneath the letters was a journal, Dad's handwriting filling page after page. Not a daily diary, but periodic reflections, observations about his sons, about fatherhood, about watching us become men. I sat there on the dusty attic floor and read portions of it, tears blurring the words. Dad had understood more than I'd realized. He'd seen Derek's insecurity behind the bravado, the fear that drove my brother's need to appear successful. He'd hoped Derek would find genuine confidence eventually, would realize that self-worth can't be borrowed or financed. But he'd also seen who I was, steady, present, reliable, and valued it in ways he'd never quite articulated to my face. A month after the will reading, I ran into Derek at the grocery store. It was awkward, inevitable in a town this size. We stood there in the produce section, both holding shopping baskets, neither knowing quite what to say. He looked tired. The expensive watch was gone from his wrist. "Michael," he said finally. "Just my name, nothing else." "Derek." We stood in silence for another moment. Then, surprisingly, he spoke again. "I've been doing some thinking. About Dad. About the funeral, what I said." His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I was wrong. Not just about the will, about everything. I spent so long trying to prove I was successful that I forgot to actually be present. I didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than I'd expected to ever get. "Dad loved you," I said, because it was true and because Derek needed to hear it. He was just disappointed sometimes. There's a difference. Derek's eyes got shiny. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Then he said, "Lisa and I are separating. Have been for a while, really. Turns out when your marriage is built on maintaining appearances, there's not much left when the appearances can't be maintained anymore." I felt a complicated mix of emotions, sympathy, vindication, sadness for the waste of it all. "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. He shrugged, a gesture that tried for casual but fell short. "Maybe it's what I need. A chance to figure out who I actually am without all the performance." We talked for a few more minutes, carefully, like people relearning a language they'd once shared. Before we parted, Derek said something that surprised me. "You know what Dad wrote in that letter? He said you were the son who understood that showing up was more important than showing off. That being useful mattered more than being impressive." He paused, looked at his shoes, then back at me. He was right. I wish I'd figured that out while he was still here to tell. I watched him walk away down the aisle, his posture less rigid than I'd seen it in years, something defeated but also oddly hopeful in his gait. Maybe this was rock bottom for my brother. Maybe it was also a foundation to build something real on. I didn't know. That wasn't my journey to take. I finished my shopping and drove home, where Sarah was working in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. I stood watching her for a moment before she noticed me. This woman who'd chosen a simple life with a water treatment engineer and never once looked back with regret. That evening, sitting on our porch again, it had become a ritual, this quiet time together. I told her about the encounter with Derek. She listened, as always, then said, "Do you think you'll ever really reconcile? Be brothers again in some meaningful way?" I thought about it carefully. I don't know. Maybe. But I've realized something these past few weeks. Dad's inheritance wasn't just the house or the money. It was the lesson in what actually matters. Derek's starting to learn it now. Whether he fully gets there or not isn't my responsibility. The following weekend, I finally went through the last room in Dad's house. His study, the place where he'd spent his retirement years reading, thinking, occasionally writing. His old desk was solid oak, built to last generations. In the top drawer, I found one more letter, this one addressed simply to Michael in Dad's familiar script. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. The letter was dated 2 weeks before he'd died, during a period when I'd thought he was having a good spell, his mind clear, his spirits relatively high. He must have written it knowing the end was near, but wanting to craft his final words carefully. Son, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've already dealt with the will situation. I hope I made the right choice. Not about the money. That part was easy. You earned it through presence, through showing up, through being the kind of man your mother and I hoped you'd become. But I hope I didn't create a permanent rift between you and your brother. That wasn't my intention. Derek has his struggles, his insecurities, his need to prove something to a world that isn't even paying attention most of the time. I understood that, even if I couldn't fix it. My hope is that losing what he thought he deserved might teach him what actually matters. And my hope for you is that you won't confuse being right with being superior. You're the better son in the ways that counted to me, but that doesn't make you better than Derek as a human being. Just different. Just more aligned with the values your mother and I tried to live by. The letter continued, Dad's voice clear in every word. I've watched you build a life of substance, Michael. Not flash, not show, but real foundations. A good marriage. A daughter who's going to do important work in this world. A career that serves your community in ways most people never even think about. You kept your word, showed up when you said you would, did what needed doing without needing applause. That's the measure of a man in my book. But here's what I want you to understand. The inheritance I'm leaving you isn't really about the money or the property. It's about acknowledgement. It's me saying, out loud and in legal terms that can't be ignored, that I saw you. I saw every 2 a.m. emergency call, every Sunday dinner, every oil change you did on my car, every time you adjusted your schedule to drive me somewhere. I saw the patience, the steadiness, the quiet competence. And I valued it more than I probably said while I was alive. Men of my generation weren't good at that kind of talk. But I need you to know it now. You made my last years bearable after your mother died. You gave me purpose, gave me connection, gave me reasons to keep going. That's worth more than any house or bank account. So take care of that property if you want it, or sell it and use the money for something meaningful. Either way, know that it represents every moment you gave me, every conversation, every gesture of care. You earned it not through obligation, but through love, and that makes all the difference. I sat in Dad's study for a long time after finishing the letter, the paper still in my hands, the afternoon light shifting across the walls. The house was quiet around me, holding decades of memories in its walls, its floors, its bones. Sarah found me there eventually, as I knew she would. She read the letter, her own eyes tearing up, then pulled me close. He loved you so much, she whispered. He really saw you. We decided that afternoon to keep the house for our daughter, to hold it as a kind of trust for the next generation. Emma could use it someday, or we could sell it then and help fund her future, her dreams, whatever shape those took. For now, it would stand as a reminder of what Dad had built, what he'd valued, what he'd tried to teach through example rather than lecture. Over the next few months, life settled into a new normal. I continued my work at the treatment facility, where I'd recently been promoted to operations director, overseeing the entire system. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career dealing with water, with flow, with the infrastructure that keeps things moving cleanly beneath the surface where most people never look. Maybe that was a metaphor for how I'd lived my whole life. Derek and I saw each other occasionally, carefully cordial interactions that weren't warm but weren't hostile either. He'd moved into a smaller apartment, was working at a more modest job, seemed to be slowly dismantling the facade he'd built and finding something more authentic underneath. 6 months after Dad's funeral, I received a text from Derek. Just a few words. Can we talk? Coffee sometime. We met at a diner downtown, the kind of place with vinyl booths and unlimited refills, nothing fancy or impressive. Derek arrived first, already sitting in a booth when I walked in. He'd lost weight, looked more like the brother I remembered from our 20s, before the ambition and insecurity had hardened into armor. We made small talk at first, weather and local news, feeling our way carefully. Then Derek said, I've been seeing a therapist, working through some stuff. She asked me what I actually wanted from life, and I realized I didn't know. I'd spent so long trying to impress people that I'd forgotten to ask myself what would actually make me happy. I listened, sipping my coffee, letting him talk. I think I resented you, he continued, staring at his own cup. All through our 20s and 30s, I resented how comfortable you seemed with your choices. How you weren't constantly chasing something bigger, something more. I thought that meant you lacked ambition. But you just figured out something I'm only now learning. That contentment isn't the same as settling. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since we were kids. Honesty. Vulnerability. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for us to suddenly be close. But I wanted you to know I'm starting to understand what Dad saw in you. What he was trying to teach me by giving you the inheritance. We talked for over an hour, maybe the longest genuine conversation we'd had in decades. I told him things I'd never articulated before, about the satisfaction I found in solving complex engineering problems, about the pride I felt watching Emma pursue meaningful work, about the quiet joy of a stable marriage to someone who knew all my flaws and loved me anyway. Derek talked about his fear of being ordinary, about how his marriage to Lisa had been based on mutual ambition rather than actual connection, about the relief he felt now that the pressure to perform was finally lifting. When we parted, he shook my hand, then hesitated and pulled me into an awkward hug. Thanks for meeting me, he said, and for not being smug about how things turned out. I laughed at that, couldn't help it. Derek, I'm too tired to be smug. I'm just trying to live my life. He smiled, a real smile. Yeah, I'm learning to do the same. Driving home, I thought about Dad, about the lessons he'd taught through action more than words, about how the greatest inheritance wasn't money or property, but the example of a life lived with integrity, of showing up, of valuing substance over show. I thought about the water systems I managed, miles of pipes and treatment processes invisible to the people whose lives depended on them. Infrastructure that worked precisely because it didn't need attention, didn't demand recognition, just reliably did its job day after day, year after year. Maybe that was Dad's final lesson, that the most important work happens beneath the surface, unseen and unappreciated until it's suddenly not there anymore. A year after Dad died, Sarah and I hosted Thanksgiving dinner at our house. Emma brought her boyfriend, a quiet guy studying renewable energy who reminded me a bit of myself at that age. And surprisingly, Derek came too, alone, carrying a store-bought pie and an uncertain expression. The dinner was small, simple, nothing fancy. We ate turkey and stuffing, passed dishes around our worn kitchen table, talked about work and school and the weather. Normal things, comfortable things. At one point, Derek raised his glass of wine and said, I want to make a toast. To Michael, who showed me what actually matters. And to Dad, who tried to teach me but had to wait until he was gone for me to finally listen. We drank to that, the moment both sad and hopeful. Later, standing in our backyard while Sarah and Emma cleaned up inside, Derek and I watched the sunset. I'm dating someone, he said quietly. A teacher. She lives in a small apartment and drives an old car and doesn't care at all about impressing anyone. It's terrifying and wonderful. I smiled at that. Sounds like maybe you're finally figuring it out. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think maybe I am. We stood there in comfortable silence, two brothers who'd taken very different paths, but were maybe, finally, finding a way to understand each other. Dad's inheritance had been more than property or money. It had been a mirror, forcing both of us to look at who we really were, what we'd actually built with our lives. For me, it had been validation, acknowledgement, the recognition I'd quietly craved. For Derek, it had been a necessary destruction, a breaking down of false foundations so something real could finally be built.